Chance. Like two small logs floating in the sea, drifting to touch each other before going their separate ways, some things in life happen by coincidence, but with far-reaching consequences. The day dawned slowly. It was a Friday, the second half of March. Long known as Arakusia, and once popularized by Alexander as Kandahar, the city was now bustling with life. People were gravitating toward the Sherwali Maidan with an unusual kind of restlessness. Taliban soldiers stood at 3- and 4-way junctions, allowing pedestrians and vehicles to pass only after searching them thoroughly. The roar of the crowd grew louder as more and more people joined the gathering. The Russian troops had been ousted, but Najibullah's reign had continued for a while longer. Once he was dethroned, Afghanistan crumbled into several factions. Soon after, the student revolutions in some areas, such as Kandahar, came under the possession of the Taliban. A strange order had been issued to the Taliban soldiers that day, and they were intent on executing it to the letter. Only those with beards of a minimum length of 4 fingers were allowed into the Maidan. Those with long beards sauntered in casually, while those with slightly shorter ones were examined closely by the soldiers. Some others, even after they expounded at length on the qualities of their beards, were mercilessly turned back. They loitered nearby, peering into the arena from a distance. Half-naked and undernourished, younger boys weaved their way through the masses, forming shapes of semicolons and commas in their wake. Several yards away, entirely unaffected by the turmoil ahead, a man, a few years beyond 60, readied himself for the day at leisure. He was both the hero and the anti-hero for that day. Generous bombing by the Russians had reduced a building with 4 stories to a house with just 1 floor. Square holes were left behind in the walls to facilitate easy shooting, not unlike those in ancient forts. The women lived in a hut immediately behind the main house. It was a joint family of 20, and, as in any village, there were duties allocated to each age group. An old woman sat in the front making cheese balls and putting them out to dry in the sun. She selected well-formed stones to disperse the crows, shouting, "Uraksha! Uraksha!" as she did so. She was blind in one eye. One particular raven was a repeat offender. It sat with its head tilted to one side, challenging the woman for another round. But she was hell-bent on completing her task, one eye and all, and refused to be distracted. At that time of the day, the men in the house were working in the fields, while the younger boys foraged for wood. The older women, having assigned a long list of tasks to the young widow, Rasima, busied themselves tending to the children. Rasima was washing the clothes, beating on them until her hands ached, the sun relentless on her back. She had the kitchen to attend to after that. That day she had another important duty. The old man had taken a fancy to the landy meat that hung suspended from the roof in a gunny bag. This quirky taste could have been because of the winding up of winter, or perhaps he wanted to celebrate the day. She was softening strips of the marinated dried meat, picking each one up and beating on it with a stout rod. Those strips of meat would go into a pot of boiling service soup to be flavored. Once fully cooked, the meat would be removed, and the men would all sit in a circle, soaking the maize bread in the soup and relishing the meat strips. The women would eat after the men finished, and if Allah bestowed his benevolent grace on her that day, she might get some of the meat, too. The raven swooped clumsily from the sky to dodge a stone the old woman threw. Whenever she flung a stone, Rasima felt as if it was aimed at her heart. She had heard reports of men and women being lined up in rows and stoned to death. They were saying it was like that in the Taliban reign. Perhaps the trials of these times were tame compared to the atrocities of those bygone days. The old man looked like a guest at a wedding feast. He had combed his long white beard, wore a white salwar, its holding strings tied tightly. He picked up the green-bordered shawl from Swat, threw it over his right shoulder, and brought it in the front under his left arm. He folded the cameel cloth into 4 and wrapped it around his head like a turban, letting the ends cascade over his left shoulder. He had taken great care to make sure that the fan-like folds of the turban were high and proud, an uncreased fan-fold for an unruffled countenance. Rasima watched the old man's ostentatious preparations through an opening in the chador that covered her head, her eyes a veil against the storm raging within her. Her father-in-law's elaborate self-decoration sickened her. The other men and women of the household saw him off with a certain, barely suppressed, expectation. He picked up the gun that hung on the wall. It had been bought long ago in exchange for a milch cow. He stepped out, toting the gun on his right shoulder. Rasima rammed the landy meat with her rod in her hand, using all her strength, until it became a pulp. The Maidan had not been built to withstand the tension and curiosity of this level. It had never before witnessed such a huge, jostling crowd, nor had it seen a problem of this nature. A lean pashkana tree stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by buildings and walls in various stages of dilapidation, a proud contribution by the Taliban to the destruction already caused by the Russian warplanes. Those in charge of the sound system were tying the speakers to the trees, walls, and roofs of buses, and checked repeatedly to see if they worked properly. The Taliban graciously watched over the throng to prevent a riot. They deftly accomplished this with their thick boots and the butts of their guns. As nobody knew from where the prisoner would be brought in or where he would stand, the crowd kept shifting its position. A dust-covered lorry pulled in front of the arena and stopped abruptly. 3 Taliban judges with flowing beards emerged, their beards in ascending order, the first one white, the next one a mixture of black and white, and the last one dark black. They went to their appointed seats and sat down. The one who appeared to be the oldest of them all stood up and began to speak over the public address system. Bismillah ar-Rahim ar-Rahim. We are gathered here to punish Qasim Alemi, who has committed a grievous murder. As the prisoner has accepted full responsibility for his crime, the Taliban court awards him the death sentence. He raised his hand and signaled, and 2 armed soldiers dragged the prisoner in like a sacrificial goat. Qasim used to be a handsome man with a straight back, a fair complexion, untrimmed beard and blue eyes. His body now was emaciated, with his bones showing through his skin. He was bent over double with his hands tied behind his back. But his heart was free. Their friendship had been the sort that had an early beginning. Even from an early age, Rasima's love for him had been boundless. She had roamed the streets with him under the pretext of collecting firewood. In their childhood innocence, they had discussed and decided any number of issues. Qasim remembered stopping to stare into her eyes. Her eyes were so eloquent that with the slightest movement they conveyed countless messages. As soon as she came of age, things began to happen. Qasim was a boy of absolutely no consequence, while Ahmed was a grown man. She was married off to Ahmed when she was only 13. Ahmed's younger brother, Niasi, was 3 years old at the time, and in the early years of her marriage, Rasima and Niasi were playmates. Barely 2 years later, her life was shattered as Ahmed stepped on a landmine and was killed instantly. They said that it would take 60 years to clear all the landmines the Russians had laid in their land. It was not uncommon for at least one person to die every month from a landmine, and that month it was Ahmed's turn. Custom demanded that she married Niasi. Rasima, as a young widow, often carried Niasi on her hip. The women of the village made fun of her, saying, "Hey, how do you like it? Your husband never seems to get off your hip." Rasima had to raise Niasi and prepare him to become her groom. Like drops of milk that gradually filled a pitcher, the days went by, until Niasi reached his 18th year. The elders spoke of her marriage with Niasi immediately after the harvest. She was at the peak of her womanhood then. Rasima's eyes were heavy and weary by the time night fell. When she finally crawled into her space between the long-necked water pot and the tandoori oven, sleep eluded her. She finally shook her blanket off and crept out into the open, under the pretext of answering a call of nature. She stood there, looking up at the sky, thoughts of Kasim racing through her mind. It all happened quite accidentally. Winter stood with its leg wedged in the doorway. The entire village was busy hoarding food for the cold months ahead. Women were never allowed to work outside of the house except during extenuating circumstances, such as this. Taliban law stipulated that girls over 9 years of age could not go to school. Rasima's young companion had gladly used that law to her advantage. She had on her head a load of maize stalks, her wages for a 10-hour stint in the fields. She ran home ahead of Rasima with the alacrity known only to a girl of her age. Rasima had felt strangely free that day. She did not know the cause of it. After making sure she was alone, she took off the veil that covered her face and let the soft breeze stroke her face gently. The wind and sun were strangers to her. She rarely experienced those God-given luxuries. It was on that day, sojourning in abandon, with the sun and cool air caressing her face, she allowed herself to enter a secret world. Kasim Alemi was returning from a full day's work in a cave well. He rounded a corner to stumble upon a wondrous vision. Reveling in the new world she had discovered, Rasima did not notice him. Her childhood friend had disappeared from her range of vision when, at 11, she had started to wear a veil. Kasim, who had joined the Mujahideen movement, had come home at the end of the war, once the Russian forces had been driven away. When she saw Kasim, a sudden calm spread through her. He led her to a hidden spot behind the underground well, and she followed without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing to do. Her body thrilled, like a river frozen in the winter, coming shamelessly to life upon seeing the sun. Her coarse, traditional clothes had been designed as if with an intent to stifle her beauty. They entwined her body relentlessly, hiding her slender form beneath layer upon layer of cloth. She lay looking up at the herds of clouds. One burst at the moment he embraced her. They were drenched in that downpour. Darkness was knee-deep by the time she reached home. Everyone was busy making bundles of cornstalks. She pulled her veil far down her front and closed her eyes so that the light from her heart would not shine through them. Somehow, her secret did not remain with God and the wind. The boy whom she had raised came to know of her tryst. The next day there was an argument between Kasim and Niasi that ended in a fist fight. The two adversaries had neither planned nor come prepared for an altercation, and somehow it started during the regular Shura meeting as a dispute over water. In the argument that took place in front of the village elders, no mention of Rasima was ever made. To some, it seemed that Niasi had instigated the quarrel. At the height of the confrontation, Kasim shot Niasi dead. In the inquiry that ensued, Kasim accepted his guilt and was sentenced to death. If the affair with Rasima became public, Taliban law would decree they both be stoned to death. Kasim would not betray Rasima. A mujahideen doesn't betray. Allah's mercy is limitless. To err is human. To forgive is Allah's nature. Forgiving the criminal now rests with you. Will you forgive him?" The judge addressed the old man. The old man came to the center of the Maidan, caressing his beard. He placed his right arm over his heart and spoke into the microphone. "I am the father of Niasi, who was murdered mercilessly by this monster. I will never forgive this sinner, ever." Except for the thunder of the heartbeats of thousands of people, there was silence. His white beard shining, Rasima's father-in-law held his AK-47 firmly in his hand. He looked momentarily into the face of the man who had killed his son. A Taliban soldier blindfolded Qasim with a black cloth, took him to the tree, and made him stand under it. With his hands tied behind and his eyes blindfolded, the prisoner stood helplessly for a minute before collapsing into a fetal position. The Taliban judges took the gun and examined it thoroughly before returning it to the old man. He was given permission to take Qasim's life within a maximum of 3 attempts. He switched the gun to manual mode and got ready. The crowd was in a frenzy of impatience by then. "Shoot! Shoot! Shoot the murderer!" The chants began softly but escalated into a roar. The blindfolded Qasim turned toward where the people had assembled and cried out in a feeble voice, "Oh, Haji Sahib, Haji Sahib, forgive me." But the old man's heart had hardened. He straightened his gun slowly and looked through the eye-hole. The victim looked bent, like a curved letter of the alphabet, as he aimed at the spot between his target's right eye and ear. He steadied his gun and placed his finger on the trigger. The cries of the crowd had come to an absolute stop, a collective bated breath. Those who had drawn in their breaths and those who had just exhaled held them there. The old man pulled the trigger. A soft pfft escaped. No one saw the bullet fly or hit the target. They looked at each other uncomprehendingly. It took a while for the crowd and judges to realize what had happened. The old man took aim a second time. Qasim was shaking his head from side to side, screaming like a deranged man. The face of the old man, previously impassive, showed signs of fear. The expansive silence unnerved him. The victim's back spread broadly before him. He could finish the job if he fired his bullet in there. Just as the bullet came headed for his spine, Qasim tilted his head and squirmed out of the way. The bullet grazed his shoulder, and faint marks of blood appeared. Thinking he was dying, Qasim twitched in all the 4 directions like a beheaded cock. The crowd was stunned. Qasim had now managed to crawl his way to the edge of where the crowds had gathered. The old man looked helpless and confused, totally at a loss as to what to do. Someone shouted, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Allah has forgiven him! Don't shoot!" Others joined in. The old man stood there for a while, weighing his options. He spent his 3rd bullet, aiming it down at the ground. He then held his gun aloft overhead and walked away. The weight on his chest floated up into the air, as did the dust that the 3rd bullet had raised from the earth. The crowd dispersed. They went to their shuhar prayers, talking amongst themselves about the marvel of Allah's mercy. Qasim, who had escaped 3 bullets, had been forgiven by Allah. The young cowherds went searching for the bullet shells in the ground. Long after the crowds had disappeared, the scent of gunpowder still lingered. Rasima's house was silent. All the men had gone to the Maidan, and the women were all pretending to be busy. Rasima pulled her veil over her head and went about her work. Though her hands were furiously scrubbing the karuth plank, her ears were attuned to the sounds from outside. Qasim had been with her for just one memorable day, behind the underground well. A few more moments, and he would be dead. She had strained to listen to the intermittent sounds that came over the public address system. She had heard her father-in-law's stately voice and Kasim's faint pleas for his life. She pleaded silently to the old man to forgive Kasim. Just as Rasima expected, the gunshots came. The first was very faint, followed by a second shot that was loud. Then came the roar of the crowd, and finally a third shot. Rasima stuffed her veil into her mouth, and her body shook. It was over. The pot of landy meat was boiling. It boiled as if it had understood the violent waves that engulfed her. There was no respite. Rasima did not stop weeping. Some thought she was weeping for her brother-in-law who had been killed a few days ago. Others assumed that the memory of her first dead husband had come to her. She could not bear the thought that Kasim was gone even before his nail mark on her had disappeared. She did not know he was alive. Like two pieces of driftwood in the ocean, their paths might cross again. It could be many, many years. But it wouldn't be all that impossible.